Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Roebling, and on behalf of the Union League Club of Chicago, it's a real privilege to welcome all of you and each of you to this conversation about Well Worth Saving, the new book from Yale University Press by Laurel Leff, who is joining us now. So I want to say that none of these programs happen by themselves. It takes a lot of sponsors and co-sponsors. So I want to acknowledge the Standard Club of Chicago for its support, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation, Chicago Loop Synagogue, the Iowa Jewish Historical Society, and we have the Jewish Community Alliance of Northeastern Pennsylvania. We have the Jewish Federations of Dutchess County, Fort Wayne, Peoria, the Quad Cities, Greater Rockford, Illinois, and Western Connecticut. We also welcome and acknowledge the support and the co-sponsorship of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the World Jewish Congress. So we acknowledge and thank all of our co-sponsors. Lunch at 65 West is part of the public affairs program at the Union League Club. And it's been our privilege over the last year to work very closely with Union League Club and Standard Club member Michael Trayson. We'll be going to Michael in just a second, but I want to take this opportunity to say to all of you that the second half of today's program is going to depend on your questions. We've got the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen, So you can use the Q&A function to type out your questions, and we'll be shepherding those along to Michael and Laurel when the time comes. So until then, I now hand it off to attorney, counselor, advisor, and I would say generally sagacious guy, Michael Trayson. Michael.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Welcome, Laurel. Welcome to everybody who's tuned in today. We have been talking about how, thank goodness, COVID has allowed us now to leave our homes, and attendance at these Zoom programs becomes more and more challenging. Although people want to see it, they're out on the street, they're in their offices. It's not as easy as it once was, if I can use the word easy. So thank you all for joining us today. The thing that Chris mentioned, I want to reiterate, and that is there's a Q&A button. Please do send your questions. Chris will be monitoring it. I'll try to monitor it, and then we'll get to the questions and answers also. For those that have been following these presentations, you know that we couldn't be doing it without Alan Ross and the Jewish Federation of the Quad Cities. They've really been integral to all of this. And we really want to recognize Alan. He's not on today like he normally is, but we appreciate all that he does. We've had several different interviews over the last many months. And two of them, anyway, dealt with refugee issues. You may recall we interviewed Rosie Whitehouse from London about her book, which was about refugees after the war, and especially those who made their way to Palestine aboard the Wedgwood. Rosie is not an historian, but more of a journalist. And we also interviewed David Nassau. We talked to him about another book, a new book about refugees and survivors, and that was The Last Million. Reading Laurel Leff's book, we have the privilege of somebody who is a journalist, who knows how to write, how to tell a story, and researches like an historian, and is praised for how comprehensive her work was. I found myself devastated reading her book. I think that's the best word I can use. These people were helpless. They could have been saved by very nice people who we would all be happy to have a coffee with today, but many of them turned their backs on people who were Jewish, or in some cases, too Jewish, or too East Juden, as opposed to Western European. The book weaves together a huge picture, and yet at the same time, Laurel tells us individual stories, following certain individuals throughout her book, coming back to them. And then when you read the last part, the epilogue, it's page after page of individual stories, people who survived in some cases, and mostly people who did not survive. Before I introduce Laurel formally, let me set the stage a little bit. The time period we're talking about is what some of us think is the time period of the Shoah, 1933 January, from the ascension to the chancellorship by Hitler until 1945. But in some ways, obviously, none of what happened in 33 could have happened if there hadn't been a 32 and a 31 in the 1920s and World War I and on and on.
Right.
And in addition, the story doesn't conveniently end on May 8th, 1945, nor does it end in September 1945. The story goes on and on. In some ways, even the latest news from the Middle East is a continuation of this story. Obviously, reading this book, one wonders how the story would have been had there been a nation state for the Jewish people as there were for others. Today, the implications of the existence of the state of Israel make this story a unique story. One more item I'd like to throw into the mix on the context. We will recall 1938, not just for the November pogrom in Germany, but also for the Evian Conference. The Evian Conference had occurred months before that pogrom, and in my view, it was foundation stone for that pogrom, because the Evian Conference was proof that the world really wasn't going to do anything about what was happening. When Adolf Hitler assumed the chancellorship, 1, 2, 3 months later in May and continuing through 1933, Jews were disenfranchised step by step through civil service laws, through many different steps, all the way through the 1930s. And when the war finally broke out in 1939, September 1, it was not unexpected. Jews in Vienna started to run after the Anschluss, but they stayed there until the Anschluss. So this is the bigger picture. Laurel, we're so pleased to have you with us here today. Thank you very much for being here. Can I start by asking you, after writing Buried by the Times and giving your public a real keen knowledge of how the press handled reporting, that was already 16 years ago, what brought you to this story?
Let me first just say I apologize for being a little bit late. We're at a country house and I had some technical difficulties, so I do apologize. And I'm, very impressed by all of the sponsors you had for the program. It's great. So I'm really happy to be here. So my work on this did very much come out of working on Buried by the Times. One of the things that I think, there are many things that surprised me in researching that book, but I think one of the things that did the most was that the family that owned the New York Times, which would be the Ochs-Sulzberger family, so it's both the wife and the publisher. The Ochs side of the family is the wife, and the Sulzbergers of the publisher side were of German Jewish descent, and had relatives, relatively distant relatives, but relatives in Germany that wrote to them asking for their help in emigrating. And some of them they helped, some of them they didn't. But I was very much taken by that story. It seemed to me that there were far more Americans who played this sort of individualized role as opposed to just protesting or doing other things in terms of trying to save Jews in Europe during the Nazi era. And it's also true, sort of, as I went through other people's archival files, there was almost always a folder that was very similar to that was people, relatives, sometimes friends, sometimes people they didn't know at all, asking for help. So that's when I made the decision to sort of try and do more, not focusing so much on the government, although the government always intrudes, and not focusing on Jewish organizations, because I felt like that territory had been covered, but more looking at other kinds of institutions within American society who were in a position to help and either did or didn't. And so that's kind of what brought me to universities, although I also have to say, and I know you're a lawyer, I also did something looking at lawyers and journalism organizations. I did something looking at doctors. These are all for papers, not for book publications. But it seemed to me the story of the universities was the one that really deserved a full-length book exploring it.
You wove together so many different parts of this story as only a journalist can, I think. The story of the universities, the differences between the New School for Social Research on the one hand and Harvard on the other hand. And you also mentioned here in Chicago, we have the University of Chicago, we have Northwestern, you mentioned them several times, as well as Wayne State University from my hometown of Detroit. Let's start by asking you to comment about distinctions among and between the universities and their presidents and their reactions.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing probably to say is that none of the presidents of any institution besides the New School, which is kind of a different beast entirely, which I'll explain in a second, behaved extremely admirably. There were some who were better than others. I think it's probably fair to say that the larger public institutions in the Midwest and the West were somewhat better, although they also had to worry about state legislatures and the kind of potentially negative publicity that could arise out of bringing Jewish, socialists, communists, whatever, to teach at their faculties. And there was some of that. Probably the biggest resistance, however, and probably this isn't surprising, came from the more elite institutions, the Harvard, Yale, Princetons, who had trouble with Jews in general, and not just hiring foreign refugee faculty. And again, this is part of what maybe surprised me a great deal, was that most of those institutions did not hire many Jews. They, in fact, a lot of those schools had what they referred to as the one Jew rule, meaning you could hire one Jew in the math department or geology, and that was okay. But as soon as you hired another one, then you ran the risk that the department would be overrun by Jews. So there was a lot of hesitance about hiring Jews to begin with. And then when you say, we've got our one Jew, but now we're thinking of hiring on this foreign refugee Jew, that sort of might tip the balance in terms of Jews overrunning the place. I do want to talk just quickly about the New School, because you mentioned it, and it is a completely different model, which was the president of the New School was a man named Alvin Johnson. He was a political scientist by background. He had edited the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in the 1920s, and he had many connections with foreign scholars. So what he decided to do was at that point, the New School was only an undergraduate institution. And what he decided to do was to create a graduate faculty and a graduate program. And it would be made up entirely of foreign exiles who needed refuge in the United States. That was the idea. And he would pick the ones that he thought were the best. And that would be what the faculty was. And that was the way that it worked. It was important because just, they hired about 100 refugees in and of themselves, but it also became very important because unlike the other universities whose hiring was basically the way they'd always done hiring, the way we do hiring today, if anyone's an academic. You have a committee, the committee interviews a bunch of people, you then make some suggestions to the university either accepts them or rejects them, and it could be a very time-consuming process. As soon as you get to 1940, 1941, particularly after the invasion of France, and that's when the deportations begin to Poland. Then in order to save anybody, you needed to move really quickly. You couldn't go through this cumbersome administrative process, and none of the other schools were willing to give up on that. So really, in some ways, in that really difficult period, the new school became the best hope for getting anybody out of Europe. But there were differences. And I think, though, the biggest difference that I found was not just in, I mean, the university administrations, again, with the exception of the new school, were basically anywhere from hostile to indifferent about this process. There were no administrations that really took this on. What was a different factor, though, was if there was one or two or three faculty members who were really committed to doing this. And there were at several universities. I mean, I talked about Harlow Shapley at Harvard. There was someone at Yale, there was someone at Berkeley. And if you had, you know, a really activated individual, or even I start with Ruth Lautenberg at Princeton, they could make a difference in terms of at least hiring a few people. So that's really where the difference lay, is was there a faculty member who made this almost their full-time occupation, or was it just kind of handled more routinely?
You know, I think what we should do is take a step back, and I'm not sure how many people in our audience have already read this book, and hopefully everybody will who hasn't, but will you explain the difference for people between the quota visas and what we're talking about when we're discussing your book?
Yes, and that's really important, I think, and it's one of the reasons why I decided to focus in on universities, because they really had an ability to help in a way that other institutions, other individuals didn't. And the reason for that is what was referred to as the non-quota visa. As many in the audience may know, the United States in the 1920s had decided to end what had basically been open immigration, move to a numerical limit annually, and then a country by country limit on the number of people who each year could come to the United States. And for some countries, it was, you know, disastrously small. So for Poland, for example, it was about 600 people a year. It was very, very small. But, and so that made, I mean, there were other reasons as well, but that made it very difficult for refugees to come to the United States under the quota system. But what there also was a non-quota opportunity. And a lot of that was for very close relatives, spouses, children of American citizens. It was also, I think, maybe ironic in our current age, it was for anyone who lived in the Western Hemisphere, including Canada and South and Central America. But there was also a special provision for professors and for clergy. And what the provision said, and this was in the immigration law of 1924, is that if you had been practicing the vocation of being a professor or being a clergyman for 2 years prior to your application for immigration, then if you planned on carrying out that vocation in the United States, you could come on a non-quota visa, which meant you were subject to no limitations. There was no restrictions on the number of non-quota visas that could be issued. And you were also able to bring your wife, and they actually did mean wife, they didn't just mean spouse. So this, for the few women who came with spouses, this was a problem. And then also your minor children, anyone under the age of 18 also could immigrate on a non-quota visa. And what that meant is, I mean, the way the State Department interpreted that provision, it's not in the language of the statute, but it's the way it was interpreted, was that in order to believe that you were going to be practicing your vocation of professor in the United States, you needed to have an offer from an American university saying they were going to hire you as a teaching professor. Again, the addition of teaching was the way the State Department interpreted it. They required you to be a classroom teacher, not just a researcher or an archivist or any other kind of university affiliation. But if you could prove that you had an offer from an American university, then you could immigrate on a non-quota visa and wouldn't be subject to those kinds of limitations.
You alluded already to another feature that makes your book so devastating to the reader. In fact, it was bad enough to be a Jew, but to be a woman yet. And you have particular stories, and I would ask you to maybe talk about that a little bit. Hedwig Kohn comes to mind. Particularly, her story resonates with me because she came from cities that I know well, and this whole idea that she could have been saved. People could have been saved, but weren't. Can you talk about Hedwig, please?
Sure. So Hedwig Kohn was a physicist. She was one of the 4 women who had the highest rank in German universities as a physicist. She did very advanced kind of research that I don't think I could even begin to explain. She taught at the University of Breslau. That was the name of the city then when it was under German control. She was Jewish. She was fired in December 1933. I think maybe I should say just a quick bit about that as well, which is that one of the first things that the Nazi regime did in April of 1933, so remember, Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 1933, at the very end of January. So just 2 months later, they enact a law that says that no one who was Jewish or non-Aryan, which meant you had some Jewish ancestry, some Jewish background, could be employed by the state in any capacity. And all German universities were then public. So they were all state employees. So almost immediately, anyone who was Jewish was fired from their position. That happened to Hedwig and thousands of other people in Germany, and then it carried on into the countries occupied by the Germans: Austria, Czechoslovakia, France. But in the earlier period, it was just in Germany. So she lost her job. She didn't have any other source of income. So she immediately started applying to other universities in Great Britain and in the United States. Those were probably the 2 most desirable locations for academics because they had the most universities. They had the best type of universities. And just quickly by way of background, I should say that the German universities and the Austrian universities were considered first rank. So people who were top physicists at Breslau would be considered top physicists in the United States. So she started applying for this job, beginning of any kind of job at the beginning of 1934. She isn't able to get one. And I think the reason is, partly it was that she was Jewish. And as I explained, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in American universities. But there was also a great deal of reluctance to hire women. And she got back, and other people got back responses basically saying, we don't hire women for these kinds of positions, so don't even bother. So she found it very, very difficult. She did, however, have someone there to help her, which was this man named Rudolf Laudenberg. He had been her thesis advisor when she had done her thesis in physics decades earlier in Germany. He had managed to leave Germany before the Nazi regime in 1932. He went to Princeton. He became head of the Princeton's Palmer Physics Lab, so very, very distinguished position. And he made it, his mission to try and help other physicists who were trying to get out of Germany. He tried to help Hedwig, but as he said in his correspondence, her sort of double whammy, being a Jew and being a woman, made it very, very difficult for him to get her any kind of position. The other thing about Hedwig's story, though, is, and I think that this is, is an important piece of it, which is, from 33 to about 39, maybe 40, this was, it was a very difficult, wrenching process, but it was fairly orderly, right? Jews they didn't have jobs, so that was obviously a big concern, but it wasn't until 1940, 1941, that it really became a question of people's lives being endangered. Before that, it was extreme forms of discrimination. You couldn't, didn't have any money to, or a job to pay you. And there were all sorts of forms of discrimination, and it was horrible. But with, except for random acts of violence, it wasn't really life-threatening. But it became clear in 1940 and 1941, the deportations began. People began being sent from places like Breslau, first to ghettos in Poland, and then ultimately directly to extermination centers. And even being deported to Poland, people knew you were going to a ghetto. And by people knew, I meant people in the United States knew, the people who were trying to help them knew, that it would mean severe deprivations, and that would most likely life endangering as well. So Lodenberg did what, and you see this when you begin to look at the correspondence in 40 and 41, you can just feel palpably the tension and the fear that is, on the side of both sides of the correspondence, although of course, most extreme in the form of someone like Hedwig, who's trapped in Breslau. So what Lodenberg does, and I think this also showed the way, universities could work if they wanted to, is he doesn't, Princeton didn't hire women as physicists, so he had no hope at his own university. He then contacted the Association for American University Women, American Association of University Women. And what the person who was the staff person there, who'd been very involved in trying to get people out during this earlier process, did was she contacted the 6 presidents of women's universities, because he thought that would be the best chance. She thought that would be the best chance of hiring Hedwig. And she looked for the ones who she thought would be most sympathetic. She wrote to 7 of them. Most of them responded the way American universities tended to respond during this era, which was to say, we won't interview anybody unless we can, we won't hire anyone unless we can interview them directly. She's not here, so we can't hire her. She teaches too advanced a form for us to want to hire. You didn't have the woman excuse, because she wrote to all of women's colleges, but they all turned her down with one exception. The president of Sweetbriar, a little college in Virginia, wrote back and said, we don't teach advanced physics. In fact, we just have one person on our faculty who teaches physics. We don't have laboratories, but if this means it will keep her from being deported to Poland, which was the threat at that period, we'll make her an offer. And they did. Now then, and this is another, important part of the story, that the State Department, which made, you could get a university to make you an offer, but it was still up to the State Department to decide whether they were going to issue a non-quota visa. The State Department at that point decided, well, 1 year of teaching isn't good enough, because Sweetbriar to offer her a position for a year. We need 2 years. So then the staff person went back to Wellesley, which had kind of been, maybe we will, maybe we won't. And they then said, okay, we will, if I can get the people on my faculty and among my trustees who think that she might be, a subversive, who's being hired as a sort of stalking horse or something. If I can get them to quiet down, then I'll make her an offer. So she had those two offers.
There were a series of organizations that were working very hard to offer opportunities so that these academics could be rescued. Maybe you could talk a bit about the Rockefeller Foundation, the role of the Joint, the University Women Organization, and so on. And then also in terms of funding. I'm sorry, go
In
ahead.
terms of what, I'm sorry?
Funding, when they did
Oh,
give
funding,
these,
yes,
I
yes,
think
that's
people
very
need to
important. too.
understand
Yeah.
that somebody had to pay their salaries. You can talk about that.
Right. Right. Had to pay their salaries in a depression. If you're talking about the 1930s, it was the Great Depression. So there had been a cutback in university faculty in order to meet budgets. So that was very much of a concern. The way I sort of separate out the organization is there were some existing institutions who were already involved, not in refugee work, but in university hiring kind of work. So that would be the category of the Rockefeller Foundation. There also were existing institutions that were arose out of the Jewish community that were trying to help Jewish refugees. And then there were some organizations that sprang up specifically to deal with this problem. And I'm going to start with one of those because this is actually the one that's probably the most important. It was a group called the Emergent. They all have these really long names, and emergency is always somewhere in there, and committee is always somewhere in there. So it's a little confusing, but it was called the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced, first German scholars, and then it became foreign scholars when it became clear the problem was a European problem, not just a German problem. And they had committed themselves specifically to try and get American universities to hire foreign scholars so they could immigrate under the non-quota visa provision and escape to the United States. And what the emergency committee promised to do, because they were a very savvy group, they understood that it would be hard to get universities to be willing to hire people in permanent positions and pay their salaries when it was, this group started up in 1933, so in the depths of the Depression. So what they said is, if the university agrees to hire someone, we will pay half of the salary, and there'll be temporary positions for 2 years. So we'll pay half of the salary and we'll get some other group to make up the difference. So this won't cost American universities anything. So that's very important to bear in mind, is when you're thinking about the university's position, they were basically getting scholars they could pick, who were very talented. I mean, these were top great people, and not just the famous ones that you've heard of, but throughout, these were really very distinguished people, and you wouldn't have to pay their salary. So that's where this emergency committee came in, where the Rockefeller Foundation comes in. And it's also, I think, a very interesting story. Of course, the Rockefeller Foundation existed before this problem, but they had a unique sort of entree into it, which is that they funded a number of scholars who were in Germany. This was both because German universities had very good scholars. It's also because in the wake of World War I and the animosity and the Versailles Treaty, one of the things that they had decided to do was to try, to help improve relations, was to fund scholars in Germany. But what that meant was that they realized very early on, I mean, literally in April of 1933, Rockefeller Foundation staff were touring in Germany. They went from sort of places where they had scholars at universities and went, as a routine matter, every couple months they would go and check in on them. And what happened is they go to these different universities to see how their scholars are doing. They would find people who had been fired, were about to be fired, whose family members had been fired. I mean, they would literally have people weeping as they talked to them. So they understood that this was, that German scholars who were Jewish or non-Aryan were being fired in huge numbers. And they were a significant part of the German academy. I mean, it depended on the discipline and it depended on the university, but at the top universities, Jews or non-Aryans made up 30 to 40% of the faculty. So you can imagine this was sort of a devastating scene going on in Germany. So it took the foundation a while, but the Rockefeller Foundation, they eventually decided they would no longer fund any scholars that were in Germany because, not only had there been this history of firing Jews and non-Aryans, But it was also became impossible to practice anything like what we would consider to be objective scholarship. There was no academic freedom. You were employed by the government, the Nazi government, and your mission as a scholar was to carry out Nazi ideology. So the Rockefeller Foundation eventually decided they couldn't be in the position of helping scholars who were still in Germany. So they took the money that they had dedicated to support these German scholars and used it to fund the other half of the hires that universities made, with half of it being funded by the Emergency Committee and the other half by the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's the way most of the scholars who were able to come as scholars came under that auspices. I should say, though, that not all of them did. Some were able to get jobs on their own, get funded on their own, but for most of them, this is the way they came to the United States.
After I read Andrew Nagorski's book, Hitlerland, a number of years ago, and it depicts how everything that was happening in the 1930s wasn't hidden. Everybody could read it in the newspapers. They were getting reports from the consulates. We saw this thing evolving. I began to study the Jewish press in America, the local Jewish newspaper, especially Detroit and Chicago, to see what was the local Jewish population doing about all this. Did the American Jewish public know what was happening with respect to the academic potential for academics to go to the non-quota visas? Laurel?
I'm not sure they understood all of the ins and outs of that. I think most scholars don't even understand the ins and outs of that. Immigration law often seems like, oh no, it's just too complicated and I'm not going to deal with it. So I wouldn't expect most of the population did. But what I could, I think it's knowing is a very difficult term. I mean, this was something that I confronted in writing Buried by the Times too, which is just because information is presented to you doesn't mean that you know it. So I tend to prefer to think about it in terms of what kind of information was available. If you wanted to know, could you have known? And I think the short answer, as it was with almost all of the details of the actual Holocaust, the actual extermination of the Jews as well, is that information was available in the United States. In terms of the refugee scholars in particular, that was actually one of the stories I think that was considered a story that was not totally uncomplicated, but there was some sense that, Albert Einstein, right? Everybody would think about Albert Einstein and that's a good thing. So, and it didn't ever seem to be too large numbers, and it never was too large numbers. It didn't have the same feel of being overrun as it might have in some, if it was a general question of immigration or if it was more specific to a profession like doctors. So I think the easiest answer is that the information about it was in fact available, and that, to some extent, the Jewish organizations and rabbis, were, I don't want to say pushing this story, but certainly, I did a review of a book, very long book, of excerpts of sermons of rabbis during this period. What were they saying to their congregations? And one of the things that struck me, and it kind of confirmed what I had learned in doing the work for Buried by the Times, was that, all of that rabbis were, having sermons on this topic relatively frequently. So again, if you wanted to know, you could. And then again, and this is where I started my research on this, if you had any connection to anyone in Europe, initially it would be in Germany, and then in Austria, and then in Czechoslovakia, and then in France. You had relatives or you knew friends. They would start writing you letters saying, can you please help me? And so that's sort of another avenue where people were getting information out. A lot of times the letters were censored, so it wasn't necessarily like they were laying out everything that happened to them. But I've read a lot of these letters, and it's very, very clear that the people are in absolutely desperate situation. They have no place to turn. They're fearful for their, certainly their livelihoods, but at a certain point also for their lives. So if you were an American and you got one of those kind of letters, you were also in a position to have insight into what was happening in Europe. For scholars in particular, it often was they would be writing to fellow professors, right? Who they met at a conference, who did their kind of, specialized research. I mean, another reason to focus on universities was of institutions in the United States. They were at that point probably the most internationally focused, right? I mean, a lot of America was quite provincial in the 1930s and 1940s, but professors, for the most part, were not, right? So the letters were going not just to a family member, but to somebody at a university saying, can you help me get a position? Can you refer me to somebody else? Can you do something to help me? And that was, very common.
Do we know numbers? Do we know how many of these non-quota visas were actually issued at the end of the day?
Yes, so non-quota visas up until 41, there were a few in 42 and 43, but mostly the bulk of it would have been up until 41. So we only know up until 41. It was over 900. And then if you add in, so 900 non-quota visas for professors. There was another group for clergymen, and then for their spouses and children, it was about 3,000. So it was a relatively small number. Now, that doesn't mean that's all of the scholars, because as I said, some got direct positions from universities, and probably the world famous people were hired in that way. And then they may have come under a non-quota visa, or they may have come under a regular visa. It's also, but I think one important thing to think about the visas, especially as you get to 39 and 40 and 41, and as I said, that's when things get very desperate. Every scholar who got a regular visa, and some of them did, right, just because they had signed up. It was a sort of first come first basis. So for quota visas, it was just, when did you sign up for a visa? And because they sort of lost their jobs early on, they were probably more earlier on some of these lists for quota visas. But for every person who got a quota visa in 39, 40, 41, they were taking a position away from someone who could not get a non-quota visa. So that's sort of important to think about. 30 and 39 and then 40 a little bit were the only years that the quotas were filled during this time period. So that's a kind of another horrifying story, but that's again what makes the 39-40 period so dramatic, is that there's almost no hope at that point, certainly if you were from Austria or from Czechoslovakia, of getting a regular quota visa.
Thanks. That was a question from David Glickstein. There's a question also from our friend Chris Roebling with respect to the interplay between these academics and the American defense initiatives, including especially the Manhattan Project. He notes that he just finished Janet Conant's book, 109 East Palace, which tells the story of Los Alamos. Can you talk about the impact on American defense initiatives with these academics, and B, the impact just on academia of destroying both people and careers, even for people who may have survived?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. It is true that, most of the people who made up the Manhattan, maybe I shouldn't say most, because that refers to a number, it was literally more than, but many of the people who came, who worked in the Manhattan Project came as refugee scholars. and went through this process. So some of the names you encounter in looking at the Emergency Committee and Native Displaced Foreign Scholars files are some of these very famous, well-known physicists, although a lot of them also were hired separately by universities. I think one of the things that happened with physics departments is they were very reluctant at first to hire, particularly to hire Jews. A lot of the people, again, I'm going to avoid the most word, a lot of the people who were working on the Manhattan Project were Jews. But then, University of Chicago hired one or two, and they turned out to be very good scholars, very good colleagues. It made it easier to hire number 3, number 4, and number 5. So there actually tended to be sort of little networks and groups at some of these universities where they did advanced physics, where you were hiring people from Europe in that particular way. So it could be very helpful to you, but it could also hurt you. One of the things that, as I mentioned before, you got a job offer from American University, but then you also had to persuade the consuls abroad to issue you a visa. And they made it very difficult for anyone to get a visa, including these scholars. So both under the quota and non-quota provisions, they made it extremely hard. I mean, the reason that the quotas were not filled was because the State Department had a mandate not to fill the quotas, to deny people visas. What then happened in 41 and 42 is they changed the visa procedure, and then there became a group of 6 department representatives in the United States who would ultimately make a recommendation to the consuls about people coming to the United States. This is part of the security protections that were deployed after the war began, and then certainly after we got involved in the war in 1941. And they then decided, and again, this is nowhere in the statutory language, this was just an interpretation by the State Department and these people on this group, that if you weren't going to be a benefit to the American war effort, they would deny you a visa. So even if, it was, you did something completely, history or something that wouldn't have gone either way, not that you'd be a threat, but if you weren't actually helpful to the war effort, they denied you a visa. And one of the saddest cases is someone who I mentioned in the book and who I followed through was a Slavic scholar. He had been, he'd originally been born in Russia. He then studied in Germany, got his PhD in Germany, then fled. He was Jewish, fled to Paris. His name was Michel Gorlin. He then worked for the Slavic Institute in Paris. But when the Germans moved into France, into Paris, he was in one of the roundups that sent him to a concentration camp. This whole time he'd been trying to get through the Rockefeller Foundation, through the Emergency Committee, a job offer. He finally does get an offer from the New School, and he's all set to come. He has a position, what he's going to be teaching, what his salary was. But then when he gets to the point in the State Department turns down his non-quota visa because he did Slavic studies and wasn't going to help the war effort in any way. And then just, tell you a little bit about the end of the story. I don't want to tell all of the ends of the story, but I think it really shows you how this worked. Finally, he had a sister who was in the United States. He had the Rockefeller Foundation behind him. He had the whole sort of Slavic network in the United States behind him, someone at Harvard, someone at Yale. I mean, he was a young but very distinguished scholar. They finally persuade the State Department. State Department does issue him a non-quota visa. They let him know there's no word from him, and he had been sent from the concentration camp where he was in France to Auschwitz, and died 2 months later. And they actually wrote him saying, "Hey, we're now issuing your non-quota visa," after he had already died.
Part of the reason I use the word devastating for your book, just briefly, maybe you could also address the transit visa problem. There were opportunities for people to go to Sweden or Britain, but they had to show that they were going to leave within a certain amount of time. Can you address that for a moment?
Sure. So in Sweden, the concern was and this was actually from the Jewish community. So that in Sweden, this both sort of shows their generosity and also their lack of generosity. Their generosity meaning that they agreed that anyone who came through Sweden would be supported by the Jewish community, right? So you didn't have to worry about the Swedish government not wanting to take someone because they might become, as we called it in the United States, a public charge. The Jewish community agreed that they would pay for anyone who came, but they didn't want to be supporting these people indefinitely for obvious reasons. So what they said was, and this is actually what happened to Hedwig Cohen, they said, okay, we'll let you, use, so you can escape deportation, because that's what she was facing. She was facing having to be put on a train and sent to Poland. We'll let you come to Sweden, but we need some commitment that you have a job offer in the United States, so we won't have to be supporting you for the rest of your days or even for 2 or 3 years. So she was able to get that job offer from Sweetbriar, and that allowed her to go to Sweden, and then allowed her to go to Japan, to Yokohama, and sail on a ship to the United States. Each country had a different way of handling it. The other sort of area where this became very dicey was in France. France was invaded by the Germans in 1940. Not only did it have a number of its own Jewish and non-Aryan scholars, but a number of scholars who couldn't get jobs in the United States or in Great Britain or in an earlier period had gone to France. France basically had an open border, although you couldn't get a work permit. So it was kind of, you could get there, but you couldn't really support yourself. But there were a number of those people who had escaped from other places who were in France. This became enough of an issue that the United States government actually, and this is one of the rare instances, decided they were going to do something about it, which is that they decided that if you were a good enough artist, and they really did think about this in terms of your reputation and your skill, artist or academic, artists, including writers, then you could get they would give you a temporary visa to come to the United States, emergency visa to come to the United States for a limited amount of time. But at some point when Germany would not, you couldn't leave for any of the German ports. So you had to go through Portugal, and then you had to go through Spain in order to leave for the United States. And both Portugal and Spain at different times made it difficult to get those transit visas. You also had to get an exit visa from the Vichy government, which is also not easy to do. I mean, the bureaucratic impediments for these people from every country and every which way are just infuriating. I mean, if there's nothing that makes you more want to pull out your hair, is the idea that most governments, and certainly our own, which I've studied more carefully, not only did they not bend rules or make it, do anything to make it easier, but they actually actively made it harder. They threw up additional obstacles. I gave you just the one little example. You have a teaching offer. Well, you have to have 2 years of teaching offer. I mean, that's just a very small example of the kinds of things that were added to these. I mean, these people had such an enormous burden. And they also then meant they spent all of their time doing this, right? What you were doing if you were a Jew in Europe, outside of in Great Britain, in this period is you were trying to figure out how you could use the bureaucracy to enable you to get to somewhere of safety.
We only have a limited amount of time, so let's try to get to some of the questions. Rachel Hecht asks an excellent question. about Jews going to the traditional Black universities and colleges. Can you talk about that a moment?
Yes, there was actually an excellent movie, a documentary, which Rachel may have seen, on this subject. And so, the Black universities, now we would call them, the historically Black institutions, were willing to hire refugee scholars. I think because they were financially imperiled, particularly during the Depression, the idea that you didn't have to pay someone's salary because it would be paid either by the emergency committee or paid by, and the Rockefeller Foundation made it very appealing. So there were a number of scholars that did go to traditionally, historically Black colleges during this period. The numbers were not great. I think they were probably in the double digits. But still, they made a really important difference. I mean, we screened the movie that I just mentioned, which is called, I think, Swastika and Jim Crow, at Northeastern one time. And we had a woman from the law school who was doing a restorative justice project looking at cold cases from the 1930s. And we invited her to do the introduction. And, just because of her that background, and then realized she had gone to one of these institutions. And the biggest impact on her had been by this German Jewish scholar, that he had taken a number of these students under his wing. And saw their potential. Certainly coming from Germany, you had all sorts of prejudices, but you didn't quite have the same prejudices that we had in the United States. So he and I think this is a common story, was willing to think past the fact that, maybe you could be a nurse, but you could be a lawyer and you could be a law professor. And she spoke about movingly about how important he was. And then when we watched the film, there was a scene where they were, a group were trying to desegregate a lunch counter in one of these small communities. And it was this professor and her father, and she hadn't even known that. So he was in this film. And so that shows you, I think, even though there were not many that were in this position, it was an extremely important connection.
Was the largest number of these non-quota visa successful applicants from any particular country? Was it mostly Germany and Austria?
That's a really good question. I'm not exactly sure. I would assume, just because the process was longer, started in 1933 in Germany and then in April of 1938 in Austria. So it was before, just that period where it was more, you had more years and it was more routinized. I would expect that's to be the case, but I actually don't know.
Well, because we're here in Chicago, where this is originating at my end, I wanted to ask you to take a moment or two to talk about Northwestern, to talk about Mieczysław Koliński, I think it is.
Mieczysław Koliński, yeah.
Yes. Tell his story, if you will.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story too. So there was a professor at Northwestern. He was an anthropologist. He was sort of one of the disciples of Franz Boas at Columbia University, who kind of was transforming anthropology. And his interest was in what they then called Negro music, right? And so he had gone to places in West Africa, sort of looking for the roots of spiritual music, of gospel, of what we would now think of in that particular genre. But he was not a musician. He was not trained as a musician. So he actually made a connection with a young scholar at the University of Berlin, who was both an anthropologist and a musicologist. And he would transcribe, so this Northwestern professor would go to these places in West Africa. He would record the music. He would then send the tapes to Koliński when he was first in Germany, who would then transcribe them. So in what they were looking for was a connection and now it would seem very obvious, but for some reason in the 30s, this was something that was contested, but that the spirituals had origins in African music and African beats. So that's what they were doing. The Kolinsky, however, was fired from his position in 1933. He fled to Czechoslovakia first, then when Czechoslovakia was occupied, he then fled to Belgium. And the entire time he is receiving, in the mail, these tapes with this music and transcribing it for this Northwestern professor. Finally, the Northwestern professor got him a job offer at Northwestern. He was supposed to start teaching in 1940, and then the Germans occupied Belgium, which is where he is. So he is not, and he still tries to, because there still is an American embassy, because we had not gone to war with the Germans till 1941. The State Department throws all sorts of obstacles for him, even though he has a job offer at Northwestern. He has very strong support from this Northwestern professor and from Franz Boas and other very distinguished anthropologists. They make it impossible for him to emigrate. He then goes into hiding, and in hiding too, he is transcribing things, and is now considered, this process is considered one of the foundings of African American studies. The Northwestern professor went on to sort of be one of the first professors of African American studies. He was lauded by the Black Panthers for his work on connecting American Negroes to Africa, and so it too is a remarkable story.
Susan Katz asked a question that we may have covered just briefly. What was the economic impact of people having to pay the Germans to leave? They had to give up their assets. They could take a little bit out with them. People had to pay money. How did that all work?
Yeah, so it depends on the year. It started off where if you're trying to immigrate in 33 or 34, you could leave with some of your assets. By the time you get to 38, 39, the government of Germany confiscated 90% of your assets. So you had very little money. You had to pay a flight tax. That was kind of the flight tax. So you weren't paying to leave. It was, well, you kind of were. It was a flight tax. So, that was, obviously in terms of all of immigration, that was a very serious concern because, again, it was a depression that should not be forgotten. The idea of having to support additional people, whether it was hiring them at a university or getting any kind of job in the United States was considered difficult. Although I have to say that, the more I read about this period, the more I'm sort of convinced that in this time period too, the more sophisticated economic thinking understood that when you brought particularly families, well-educated people to the United States, that it was going to increase demand and therefore would lead to more employment, not less employment. And I mention that only because I think it's, again, one of those things where I think there's now more sophisticated understanding concludes that, but it's also very true in this period. If you're writing op-eds during this period, the best economic thinking makes that argument. It's kind of the know-nothings who are making we can't allow these people to come because every one of them who comes is going to take the place of an American who otherwise would be employed. So that thinking was seriously challenged in this period as well.
I was fascinated by the fact that Franz Kafka's papers ended up in Palestine.
Right.
You want to mention that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. So he had died in the 20s. I'm not trying to remember the exact year. He had left his papers to his editor, who was also a Jew. Thomas Mann tried to get him a job at American universities. He was in Czechoslovakia, wasn't able to do it. Thomas Mann, understanding the value of bringing Kafka's papers, sort of said to them, he comes with Kafka's papers, which you could now have, but none of the American universities bit. So he went to the university, to Hebrew University in what was then Palestine, along with Franz Kafka's papers.
I'm going to invite Chris Roebling to rejoin us here on the screen. This has just been a fascinating discussion.
I never knew that Max Brod ended up in Palestine for that reason.
Yes.
I think that is fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm sure
So
all.
I should say Hebrew University hired a number of scholars too. So there were a number of people who escaped by going to, like Max Brod, to Hebrew University.
Wow. Michael, thank you so much for interviewing
Thank you,
and
Laurel.
guiding the conversation.
Yeah, no, it was great. Wonderful
Laurel.
questions.
Laurel Leff, thank you. Please come to Chicago and stay at the Union League Club.
I love Chicago, so I would be very happy to do that. I've never
I'm sure
been to-
Chicago loves you, and we'd love to see you.
Okay.
And I hope you recall, as I know you made mention at the beginning, I'm going to go through this list, and I want you to be here because it's great for you to participate in this. Today's conversation, which we're kind of shifting the name to Union League Club of Chicago presents Lunch at 65 West. That's a mouthful, just like your emergency committee, but and we can't. I like to say, founded in 1879, and eventually we're going to get it right. That's our, sort of how we like to describe ourselves. The World Jewish Congress, co-sponsored today, Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Jewish Federations of Western Connecticut, Greater Rockford, Illinois, the Quad Cities, home of Alan Ross, Peoria, Illinois, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Dutchess County in New York, and the Jewish Community Alliance of Northeastern Pennsylvania. In addition to that, the Iowa Jewish Historical Society, the Chicago Loop Synagogue, which has been a staunch ally over the last 18 months, I think, with our programs, as has been the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists joined us today, and indeed our friends at the Standard Club, with a history that goes back, an interwoven history of the Union League Club and the Standard Club going back only about 110 years. So lovely.
And Julius Rosenwald was a member of both.
Many,
Okay.
many.
Okay. Very important name in this history.
It's a lovely relationship that has gone on for many years, and we hope will go on for many more years. If anybody out there has enjoyed this conversation and you think that this is your kind of your cup of tea, if you're interested in us, we'd be interested in you, and we're always open to members, especially members who have come to experience some of the programming here at the club and understand the club's commitment to public affairs, which dates from its very origin in the 1870s, when it put forward commitment to community and country as an organizing principle for our getting together. Hopefully we got that right back in 1879, and hopefully we're staying true to that call today. All of you have, and especially Michael Trayson, and our new chairman of public affairs. I want to recognize Cynthia DeLaudy, who is just taking over the public affairs responsibility for the coming club year, and we certainly recognize her leadership. So Laura Leff, great to have you. Great to see you.
Thank you again. I really
Thanks
appreciate
for chatting,
it. Great
and
conversation.
we look forward to seeing you again soon. This afternoon's conversation is now adjourned.